Okay, we're going to get started on our last keynote of the day. So let's get started on our last keynote of the day. Okay, I'd like to welcome up to the podium the indomitable Gilberto Blasini Caceres from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to introduce the incomparable Amy Villarejo from Cornell.
Good afternoon. It gives me great joy to introduce Amy Villarejo today and to welcome her back to UWM 10 years after her first visit to our campus for a CIE conference organized by Patrice Petro, Anisha Nish, and my colleague Lane Hall, who's ignoring me right now. Amy is professor in the departments of performance and media arts, as well as comparative literature at Cornell University. She has authored 3 books, co-authored 3 more books, and written 43 articles, book chapters, and review essays that have appeared in such journals as Film Quarterly, Cinema Journal, New German Critique, and Social Text, among others. And I would just want to highlight from her prolific career a couple of books. In 2003, Amy published Lesbian Rule, Cultural Criticism of and the Value of Desire, Duke University Press. And in 2005, Lesbian Rule won the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Catherine Singer Kovacs Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Film and Media Studies. In 2014, she published Ethereal Queer, Television, Historicity, Desire, also Duke University Press. And this is a book that is going to be part of the required reading for our seminar in the fall, so take a note of that, Jacob. Amy teaches on cinema and media, feminist theory, queer theory, urbanism, television, critical and literary theory, and political art. Just this year, Amy won the Morgan Chewenze and Bobby Josephine Hernandez Distinguished Prize, Teaching Prize. And this is a prize that recognizes professional faculty for excellence in teaching. And this is awarded to humanities professors only every 3 years. Amy's scholarship has continually been in the cutting edge of important debates taking place in cinema and media studies and in the humanities in general. In particular, her work has opened up fruitful avenues of critical inquiry when it comes to questions about desire, gender, sexuality, and queerness. Her work is insightful, meticulous, and creative, and her writing is elegant, eloquent, and accessible. Once upon a time, a goddess responded to Amy by saying, and I quote, "I am sorry, I cannot answer those questions. I am really too busy to understand why anyone would want them answered," unquote. Luckily for us, Amy is never too busy to answer or to ask questions that will help us understand our place in the world. Her pursuit of knowledge continues to be a great source of stimulation and inspiration. So please help me welcome Amy Villarejo.
Thank you, Gilberto. What a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, staff and other students who are supporting our work here. This is a great conference. I mean, really great. And one of the reasons that it's great for me is that I'm learning something every second. I'm synthesizing in new ways. I'm meeting new and old friends. And really can't thank you enough for making this happen. I'm also very fond of Milwaukee and the UW system, so go Badgers, go, you know. And I have deep roots in the Midwest. My grandmother was an organizer in Milwaukee in the 30s. And I was born in that other city down the lake. And anyway, it feels like home. So thank you for making it such a warm place to come. So a little bit of introduction to the paper, slightly different title than what's printed in the program. It is about the ampersand, but the ampersand has been removed from the first part of the title. I wrote a bit of this, the beginning of this essay, in response to a conference that was held at UC Berkeley. Marianne unfortunately wasn't there when I came to visit. And there was some, I think, worry maybe, but you can give me a sense of whether this was the right read, about changing the name of the department to Film Ampersand Media. What object is that? And so I wrote this beginning bit about the ampersand for Berkeley, and then have amplified it in anticipation of our work here. I think it will be immediately clear that I'm trying to get at the conceptual and political stakes of something other than cinema's death by working with its proliferation, dispersion, and differentiation instead of taxonomizing the medium's demise. And were I to concentrate on the medium's demise, I'd probably begin with its gendered corporeality, following the funny compilation assembled by Oliver Littleton for IndieWire, which is Googleable. If you'd like to do it while I read, you're more than welcome. So this is a compilation of ways of describing the death of cinema. It begins in the 1940s when Isidore Izu announces cinema's obesity, to 1962 when Truffaut diagnoses its decadence in Dr. No, to Paul Schrader's 2006 lament that it's a broken down horse. I'm not going to take that route. I have so much that I could say about how much I hate Paul Schrader, but I'm not going there. So it seems important, too, to mark the institutional and disciplinary context for the narrative of decline and resurrection, something that we've been doing again and again in noting the center's 50th birthday and its relation to thought about cinema. And the fact that such a narrative along the lines of they don't make them like they used to is part of Donald Trump's reactionary toolkit. So let's begin with the ampersand. Let's begin neither with beginnings nor endings, but with the ampersand. As you may or probably know, I confess that I didn't before doing some research. The word ampersand derives from the practice of speaking the alphabet aloud, adding the phrase per se after those letters that are themselves also words, such as the article a or the pronoun I, in order to emphasize their dual function. So that would look like this: A per se, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I per se, and so on. This was the earliest technological melding of the structure of the alphabet in Latin as it gave way to English as a signifying system, and the human voice. This vocal technology gave rise to the practice of writing and in Latin et, in order to designate this proliferation of signifiance inherent in the alphabet. A is a letter, and means A as an article, and that and is written first as et, et, and then as what is called a ligature, where two letters are conjoined or joined together typographically in a single glyph to create a new entity, one that comes to signify and. When I say new, as I'm going to emphasize in a moment, I mean that this practice emerged in the 1st century AD, and it became more widespread by the 4th century in New Roman cursive And while other ligatures diminished under the script known as Carolingian minuscule during the 9th century, the et ligature, this is the et ligature, persisted. Okay, so this I basically learned from Wikipedia, and then verified through completely fascinating histories of typography, such as the definitive 1953 work devoted to the ampersand called, titillatingly, the ampersand. So when this practice finally became widespread, the ampersand symbol, there's the fascinating book if you wish to read it. It costs like $4 to send from France. Okay, so when this practice became widespread finally, the ampersand symbol was added to the end of the alphabet as itself the 27th letter, right? So sort of images of the alphabet would include the ampersand. So that the end of the recitation of the alphabet would be X, Y, Z, or Z, and per se. And the latter, if slurred or otherwise corrupted by the situation that we all inhabit of the human voice, that sounds kind of like ampersand. And per se, and. Giving us the modern name in English for this way of writing and. The word doesn't enter the OED until the 19th century, which might be related to changes in pedagogy of recitation, and I'm not sure about that. I'd love to learn more. So what's interesting to me in any case about this history of the ampersand, a history dating back to the 1st century AD, as opposed, say, to the history of the hashtag, which is by contrast about a decade long, is that the ampersand is already all about whatever we might talk about when we talk about media. That is to say, it is about the relationship between formal systems and popular adaptations, between written structures and oral tradition, la langue and la parole, and it is also about the displacement of ontology, per se, itself, being, by conjunction. It's also about the endless process of concatenation, or thought. To be Deleuzian about it, it's the rhizomatic, and. Film, television, video art, informatics, digital media, and. So a wee bit of Deleuze for us this evening. A rhizome has neither beginning nor end, but always a middle, milieu. Between things, interbeing, intermezzo. The tree is filiation, but the rhizome is alliance, uniquely alliance. The tree imposes the verb to be, but the fabric of the rhizome is the conjunction, and. This conjunction carries enough force to shake and uproot the verb to be, to establish a logic of the and, overthrow ontology, do away with foundations, nullify endings and beginnings. So, and finally, the ampersand interpolates us into language and image. It insinuates itself into our habits and habitus, into our ways of speaking and methods of inscription. In a word, it itself mediates. It takes the letters of the alphabet and shows us their instability, their capacity to point beyond themselves, and their elemental importance. Alphabet, after all, is the chosen name of the parent company of both Google and YouTube. It adds +1 and, proliferating linkages and likenesses. In proliferating, it finds new spaces and methods. As Peggy Phelan puts it, in the immediate context of confronting the deaths of her teacher, Richard Poirier, and the superstar Michael Jackson, in quest for a method that would precisely conjoin those figures, she writes, "What we need is and. Close readings of performances and poems. More muscular math for calculating oversound, the thing not in the words, not in the melody, not in the dance, not in the meter. So let me be more clear then about what the ampersand enables or suggests. It concatenates, but it does not mean that we need to insist upon an arithmetic model of computation. It conjoins, but there's no end to what it can bring together. It is visual, but it is also linguistic, alphabetic, embodied, and oral, confounding domains that too often remain separable. It is internal to the history of the alphabet, but it also marks the limit of that system, a limit that oscillates historically. It is, in short, a species of critical figure or concept metaphor that we have come to know as deconstructive. And it allows, for my purposes here, a way of reframing an incessantly ontological focus on cinema that is also a drive toward death. So in taking a cue from the ampersand, I want in this brief talk to speak less about which objects might belong, dead or alive, to the discipline of cinema and media studies, that is, films, television programs, web series, or whatever, and more about processes of mediation themselves. I want to jettison the question of ontology, of being and of death, for what I think are rich questions about media history, cultural authority, and partial knowledge. And by partial, I mean both senses of that word, that is to say, cross-hatched with power and also never total. And. Most of all, I want to raise some specters in this land of death and ends. Whose deaths can we absorb, tolerate, or accommodate? What would it mean instead to insist upon life? Not just by multiplying or diversifying what we mean by cinema or the moving image, that is to say by just proliferating the list of objects, but also, and crucially, by changing the aperture and ambition of the question itself. So one way to reframe the question is this: how can critical theory be lived today, especially with regard to the power of art and aesthetic experience? In other words, let's vigorously make the question much more robust than one of adequate or inadequate forms, modes, cycles, or organizations of media representation. How can the way that capitalism works on the sensorium or the sensible be registered and opposed? One important phenomenological approach is exemplified by the work of Bernard Stiegler, one of the more provocative heirs to the legacy of the Frankfurt School, and a thinker who has importantly determined my research on television. And so let me talk briefly about him before turning to Franco Bifo Berardi's work, which more directly speaks to this and. And for those of you not familiar with Stiegler's work, the two main multi-volume works are Technics in Time and Symbolic Misery. They're extremely long and repetitive. And so just dip in. You'll enjoy what you read. Okay. In his many writings, Stiegler has sought to explain a generalized sense of misery in hyper-industrial society, a misery which for him results from the synchronization of consciousness with mass-produced culture. In hypothesizing how a culture of mass consumption, particularly of images, symbols, and sounds, produces passive and impoverished subjects, Stiegler extends critical theory's philosophy that emphasizes the impersonal logic of economic productivity and the standardization of experience under what his predecessors, Adorno and Horkheimer, called the culture industry. But in Stiegler's revision to the Frankfurt thinkers' treatment of the psychodynamics of late capitalism and the negative dialectics that oppose them, hyper-industrial culture, that is media, informational, digital, puts at risk our very capacity to develop as individuals through the mechanisms of primary narcissism. In his view, our impoverished and standardized culture inhibits our ability to individuate. And this is obviously a reading of Simondon, about whom we've just learned from Francesca. So in his view, our impoverished and standardized culture inhibits our ability to individuate, to attach to singularities, to recognize singular objects. It inhibits, that is, our capacity for aesthetic engagement. In the realm of the aesthetic, Stiegler finds the resources for those singular identifications or attachments to singularities. The artwork, for him, affirms and promotes processes of primary narcissism insofar as it permits identification and differentiation, a process I want to connect to the idea of proliferation in what follows. In place of negative dialectics, then, Stiegler proposes a revolution at the level of the interface between the body and technics, between one's sensorium and a technological extension or prosthesis. He argues, interestingly, that mass culture does not simply need to be negated, but rather invigorated. Since we share so much in common, from YouTube to National Archives, we have to find ways for our bodies to encounter and enliven aesthetic objects. Such a revolution would be organological, what Stiegler sometimes calls a critical project of general organology, insofar as it would interrogate and specify sites of interaction between the body and technics that allow for intervention, action, contestation, struggle, indeed revolution. Like other key thinkers of the intersection between technologies and bodies, Marcuse, Deleuze and Guattari, and Reich, to name a few to which we'll add Bifo in a moment, Stiegler links the refunctionalization of the aesthetic to a reconstitution of libidinal energy, so that our unconscious as well as embodied rhythms escape synchronization by the society of control and can be rerouted into new forms. The ampersand separates in order to conjoin. It tells us that a letter both is itself and is something else besides. For Stiegler, mass culture inhibits separation, that process of differentiation that allows us to emerge as bounded and stable ego formations. For him, in other words, and, is a continual challenge of defining ourselves within and through external objects that produce possibility as well as limit, or conformity, or pathology. As Ross Abinette puts it in his new study of Stiegler's work, it's a really fine, tight book. The relationship between the who of embodied human consciousness and the what of technological systems is the central question that's raised by Stiegler's philosophy, and I'm going to quote Abinette. He says, insofar as projective thinking is the outcome of cognitive and somatic developments that have arisen from the capacity of human beings to manipulate tools, the experience of being thrown into the world is simultaneously one of absence and supplementation, nothingness and prosthetic desire. It is from this position that Stiegler develops his genealogy of technology, or to be more specific, his account of how technical systems transform the symbiotic relationships through which human beings reproduce their collective lives, end quote. Such an ambition is echoed in Franco Bifo Berardi's book, And, Phenomenology of the End, a raucous and idiosyncratic, self-described aesthetic genealogy of capitalist globalization. In sync with other phenomenological studies of the digital universe, such as particularly the third volume of Stiegler's Techniques in Time, BIFO 2 locates a certain malaise or set of pathologies in the mismatch between digital transmission and organic reception. And I quote him, as the electronic universe of transmission interfaces with the organic world of reception, it is producing pathological effects, end quote. Among them, he cites panic, overexcitement, hyperactivity, ADD, dyslexia, information overload, and so on. He says this over and over in a number of inventively paranoid ways. It's a very paranoid book, but it's exciting nonetheless. So in one of his more environmentalist forms of paranoia, a semiotic ooze spread by the media is seeping into the infosphere, and I quote, polluting the psychosphere and provoking disharmony in psychic breathing, end quote. Another version, another set of metaphors, emphasizes the monstrous growth of this infosphere. And I quote him, the technological composition of the world changes, but cognitive appropriation and psychic reactivity do not follow in a linear manner. The mutation of the technological environment is much more rapid than the changes in cultural habits and cognitive models. The stratum of the infosphere grows progressively thicker and denser, and informational stimulus invades every atom of human attention, end quote. So for Bifo, the and of his title, and phenomenology of the end, is doing a number of things. First, it names the acceleration of what he calls semiocapitalism, an acceleration which has been a diagnostic feature of most, if not all, versions of postmodernism. For his purposes, the problem, so to speak, is not with acceleration per se, or some version of time-space compression, but with the fact that the human sensorium changes much more slowly through neuroplasticity than the stimulus of the infosphere. His position, therefore, should be rigorously distinguished from a simple position of accelerationism, whether on the left or the right. On the left, I understand that position of accelerationism to be an argument that what is properly Marxist is the recognition of the transformational power of technology, and that we should seek out and embrace new forms of collectivism that are made possible by synthetic bodies, virtual milieu, and the artificial reproduction of self-consciousness. So the left position of that is that we should embrace collectivity where we find it, even if it's in these new wacky modes. The right-wing version is the opposite claim, that to insist on the collectivist dimension of technological change is actually to inhibit that very change and its forces. So for Bifo, as for Stiegler, the key contradiction of hyper-industrial modernity or semiocapitalism is that as signifying forms proliferate, their capacity to engage the affective and intellectual life of the individual diminishes. Right? That's the crux of it. So in addition to speed then, and names this very proliferation, a mutation or transformation that seems to be describable through every material property or dimension, thicker, denser, faster, bigger, and so on. And also designates transformations that are captured less readily through science fiction metaphors of environmental degradation and monstrosity. It describes reversals of externality and internality, for example, leading to wholly mysterious sentences such as this one. The colonization of the mind and of perception is based on an interior acceleration in the perception of time, which might mean something Foucauldian. What was external in power is now automatism. But it might just as easily designate a more phenomenal fracture in the body itself, a reformulation of its rhythms and sensation. The latter, I think, corresponds to Biffo's emphasis on a transition from a sphere of conjunction, now valued as positive, to a sphere of connection, now valued as negative. So he sees us in this unsavory transition from conjunction to connection. Here's his summary of what conjunction, the positive term, enables. Collectivity happens in conditions of conjunction, while a swarm is a connected body with no conjunction, with no conscious affective collectivity. Conjunction emerges from an unmotivated, logically necessary attraction whose purpose is not implied in its pattern. Conjunction is a random concatenation whose only rule is desire. He continues, conjunction has nothing to do with belonging. While belonging entails a necessary implication and presupposes the fixing of an identity, on the contrary, conjunction does not refer to something embedded and natural. Conjunctive acts do not presuppose any meaning, since meaning is created by the acts of conjunction. In conjunction, knowledge is creation, not recognition. So let me propose that behind both Stiegler's differentiation and Biffo's conjunction, we can see the palimpsest of our ampersand, the motor for a certain proliferation and linkage. It separates in order to conjoin. So it's important to emphasize here, by way of returning, and I promise, to film and media through the frame of the and, that Biffo himself was a cultural worker in the techno industries, as many scholars of his work note. And we have a practicing friend of Biffo's here who's doing that work as well. So Radio Alice, which was enabled by the deregulation of the Italian radio frequencies in 1976, after 52 years of status monopoly, and the magazine Attraverso, founded in 1975, were both schizoanalytic in that they were anti-authoritarian and decentralized media practices, emphasizing what Biffo and Guattari would both call transversal programs of pirate intervention, displacement, and deflection. And Biffo continues to work in the media sphere, as Giuseppina Mecchia reminds us, and I quote her, Biffo's theory and practice of transversal approaches to the various aspects of the social deployment of language technologies has never lost sight of the updated forms that such deployment has taken in the last few decades. During the 1990s and the early 2000s, during the explosion of information technologies, he was deeply involved for a short while in exploring the transversal potential of practices such as hacking and open source software production. Between 2002 and 2005, at the height of the Berlusconi regime, he co-founded Orfeo TV and the general movement known as Telestreet, the television equivalent of Radio Alice, itself a form of hacking, since it exploited the fact that for a few hours in the day, one could broadcast within a limited range a television signal using a hijacked frequency. It's worth noting that even if Biffo himself is no longer personally involved in this initiative, several Telestreet enterprises are still active, although much more the case now that they're streaming on digital platforms. So let me show you Orfeo's manifesto.
Ascoltatemi! La televisione non è la verità! La televisione è un maledetto parco di divertimenti! La televisione è un circo, un carnevale, una troupe viaggiante di acrobati, cantastorie, ballerini, cantanti, giocolieri, fenomeni da baraccone, domatori di leone e giocatori di calcio. Ammazzare la noia è il nostro solo mestiere. Questa è un'interferenza. Questa è un'interferenza. Questa è un'interferenza. Il continuo sviluppo dei flussi di linguaggio e di immagine. Linguaggio e di immagine. Si vede! Va bene! Il nostro scopo è creare le condizioni. Perché ciascuno possa smettere di essere spettatore. Io sparerò alla terra. mentre sono in onda, nel bel mezzo del telegiornale delle 7.
Diventare soggetto attivo di comunicazione e diventare soggetto attivo di comunicazione un'onda di rilassatezza, un'onda di non consumo, ritmo del mondo della battaglia produttiva e militare, un'onda di calore sensuale e di resistenza ai ritmi iperproduttivi. La democrazia non è la sperimentazione reale, non è la sperimentazione del possibile, è la sperimentazione del possibile.
So let me, in the time that remains, turn to the realm of digital streaming of film ampersand media. I want to suggest that our contemporary mediascape demands understanding this phenomenon of proliferation in the context of transversal potentiality. Film, TV, new media, digital art, informatics, computational media, and so on. This is what's at stake, for example, in A.J. Christian's distinction in his recent book, Open TV, between legacy TV, linear network distribution, and open TV, bottom-up, independent, web-based distribution. This is something I've been thinking about since I first published a piece in Social Text about queer amateurism a couple of years ago, a piece that I see now to be sort of interestingly in dialogue with other kind of questions that Alexander Zalton and others have raised about these transformations. The world of networked open TV, a robust, variegated, growing sector of serial television distributed on the web, creates new knowledge and challenges old optics. Christian emphasizes three interconnected ways that it enacts new paradigms. Through creative expression supported by free labor, the world of amateurism and paraprofessionalism, about which I've written, diversity in representation through self-representation and fan-led development, and finally, flexibility in development and marketing, where open TV distributors work with sponsors and fans to support producer-led stories. In its very forms and processes, in its serial production, crowdfunding, and amorphous definition, open TV provides something like a case study in the ampersand. It shouldn't surprise us then that many web series seem modeled on arithmetic itself, or to be less literal about it, on balancing proliferation with technologies of self-enclosure. So in a non-scientific sample of about 120 web series that are somehow or putatively queer that I just made a list of, and here I'd raise questions not about whether, but how that optic of queer remains helpful. Titles suggest a running commentary on additive logic. So here are some titles of recent queer web-based series. Couple-ish. A Canadian series created by Caitlin Alexander with a zany and pre-Trumpian plot about foiling deportation through a non-binary queer marriage of convenience. I'm going to show you a piece of couple-ish. K&A, a series by Boston-based filmmaker Katie Shannon, who spun off a mini-movie about a de-gaying camp experience in the wilds of Vermont. The 3 Bits, Ex-Mormon series, anybody? Ex-Mormons? A Brooklyn-based series following the perspectives of 3 siblings on young queer and straight life and love. 3-Way, a short-lived autobiographical series by Maeve Quinlan about her triangulated living situation. +1, written by Mo Welch and Danielle Owens-Reed, playing to and on lesbian stereotypes through polished and funny writing. So as opposed to the new corporate players such as Amazon and Netflix, YouTube and Vimeo, these small-scale productions shift the logic of mass media toward embodied encounters and proliferating borderless communities. So let me set up and then show you some, this is the fun part, show you the 3rd episode of Couple-ish. Dee Warson, played by creator Caitlin Alexander, who also starred in the vampire series Carmilla, is a gender non-binary artist stressing about the cost of their apartment. Amy Warson, played by Mercedes Morris, who's an Afro-Canadian actor, so there's this interesting sort of interracialness that is never sort of narratively explained. So their sister suggests that they interview candidates for a roommate to share their costs, and they settle on the English woman Rachel Mant, played by Sharon Bell, also from the series Carmilla, who becomes close to Amy, but whose growing friendship is threatened by the coming expiration of her visa. As a consequence, she tells the Canadian government that she's Dee's common-law wife. Following Amy's advice, Rachel and Dee develop a web show that showcases their faux relationship. So this is this really like incredible nested thing where there's meta commentary about the production of web series done through a world that's wholly about simulation of this faux marriage. And I will show it to you now.
I'm living a fantasy life. Then my new internet wife. This is Rachel. She's my girl, my lady, my gal pal. Good God. Oh. This is gonna be a disaster. You two make a hideous couple. Fuck right off then. We're doing our best. They want to examine our relationship. We're gonna have to practice. And with me covering all the rent because of, we'll have plenty of time to practice. Could be a lot worse. Yeah, Dee, you couldn't look less enthusiastic. You look like someone kicked your dog. Marvelous help you are. Hey, I'm not the one who went all fake. You hauled on Dee. Told you it was a bad idea to get roommates online. Sorry. This situation is 10 cats crazy. I mean, look at us. We're setting out to, defraud Canada because you two have become such fast friends you can't imagine being oceans apart. And so you dragged me into this entirely insane plan of yours. I mean, you realize how crazy this is, right? And if it weren't for you, I would have you arrested or deported or whatever it is they do to people who claim a platonic roommate of 8 months as their common law partner of over a year. Oh, we're doing it. Let's put on our focus pants. I don't. Hear me out before you shit your pants at the possibility of failure. You can run away with words. Okay, thank you. Anyways, I go online a lot. Which is what got us here in the first place. You say potato, I say french fries, same difference. Anyways, online videos are huge. YouTube, Vimeo, everyone has a channel now. And couples, they are ridiculously popular. Ridiculously popular. Right? Vlogging, doing challenges, and being all cute together. A lot cuter than you two, but like those two English girls. I spent 4 hours watching them yesterday. Exactly. I mean, you two don't have that whole matching ginger thing going on, but hey, we'll make it work. The show must go on. This isn't considered creepy, how? Listen, take out your laptop. Start up your camera, make a couple videos acting all couple-ish, whip up a tragically romantic love story. Post the videos online, government will observe it, keep track of you. No one else will watch, don't worry. Bam, bam, boom. You got your asses covered, and I've got blackmail material for life. Just kidding about the last part. Kinda. You really think this will work? Of course it'll work. I don't. You weren't gonna say in this. You got us here in the first place. Ooh. That angle will make amazing sexual attention in the videos. I believe you. Statement retracted. Okay. Amy, get some decorations together. Rachel, clean yourself up.
We shoot in 10.
Okay, so with knowing meta-commentary, this episode charts the shift to web-based conjunctions of queer affiliations. There is even in this short clip a double session of that commentary. On the one hand, all three characters jubilantly and defiantly create queer connections, and on the other hand, the series redirects questions about coupling from authenticity to a kind of Baudrillardian simulation, from trajectories of avowed desire to pragmatic performances of citizenship. Despite its interest in simulation, however, Couple-ish, like the rest of the web-based series I've mentioned, is relentlessly autobiographical in one sense, i.e. Caitlin Alexander, a gender non-binary artist, creates a story about Dee Warson, a gender non-binary artist. Aspects of the creators and actors' lives, including the apartments where they live and film, the coffee shop where they drink and work, and the friends who populate their lives, thereby appear in these plot lines and fictional life worlds as often triumphant acts of self-representation, many of them putting queers of color, and trans folks on screen. In this simple sense, which is also the one emphasized by A.J. Christian, the various series multiply and diversify the media environment in ways that I don't want to minimize. But, or and, there is a more complicated sense in which these series are less invested in identity and belonging as modes of self-presentation than they are in generation and creation as modes of differentiation. In all of them, young people, and they're really young, I feel it, approach the world as a field for play, conjunction, and transversal deflection. And I'm going to just skip, I was going to show you an episode of K&A, which I have if you'd like to see it in the Q&A, but I want to give you time to do your thing. So A.J. Christian is importantly not just the author of OpenTV, the book, but the developer of OpenTV Beta, a platform and incubator for indie TV art and artists, primarily queers and trans people of color. Like many other artists and activists who are creating new visions for conjunction, he emphasizes the additive math of the small and the local, and. These web series take a tack that feels far away from the rhetoric of Orfeo TV and telestreets, but they too live in the space between television and the web, a space where knowledge is created, where politics are born anew. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. All right, we have a good bit of time for questions. So, all right. I'm going to play Donahue. We're all old enough to get that reference.
Thank you so much. I really loved your talk. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, reminded me this question of the ampersand, of the feminist debates around the ampersand problem, the famous text by Elizabeth Spellman from the early 90s.
I had not thought about that.
And especially since at the end of your talk you turned to these questions of identity and politics with queer web-based series. I wondered if, with those debates there was always the thing about saying women and blacks in ways that disavowed, possibilities of intersectionality. It strikes me that it's a similar issue with film and media, where film is already a medium, and so there's a kind of redundancy in that formulation. I just wonder if you see points of overlap between the ampersand and those two separate realms as you're thinking them together.
Oh, that's a lovely question. Thank you so much for the reminder about that moment. I'm trying to avoid the 90s rather than return to them. But let me think for a sec. I think here's how I would come at it. That those debates about identity presumed that there were separate things that were getting conjoined at the expense of power relations. And what I am trying to allow the ampersand to do is to create the connection in the moment of creation, right? So that it's not bringing pre-existing fields together, but it's separating aspects in order to understand their conjoined nature, right? So in that sense, in the actual history of the ampersand, right, there are resources to think about how we might think of the logic of conjunction, and BIFO, I think, is offering this too, that is about something that works against forms of identity and belonging that pre-exist and that then do this, but instead are created, right? So all of the stuff that I've been thinking about, thanks to all of you here, about what cinema has been, is now, could be, right, is about differentiation, actually, right? And not presuming the object to pre-exist. Now, that doesn't avoid the heavy-duty political problem, right, of power and asymmetry, right, which is what those debates were making visible. So I want this to be a project that can accommodate and address power and oppression, but also to do so in a way that can look at, the logic of that conjunction. To a more, as Peggy Phelan says, a more muscular math, right, that can do that work without simply presuming the bringing together of unlike identities.
I'm not sure if I have a fully formed question, but I just came from reading a manuscript. We have an article on Nollywood, and the author, Frank Ukadike, is talking about how, well, this straight to internet or straight to web, or in some cases DVD, is what has enabled this in Nollywood to exist.
Yeah.
And that creative space. And so I don't really have a question, but I was wondering if you had thought about any, or if you have any thoughts on other existing forms, non-Anglophone forms perhaps, or global forms that might function similarly, or where you might be able to also apply this idea of the ampersand, or if Nollywood would be something that didn't quite fit in that way. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
If you have thoughts on that.
Sure, I have thoughts about everything. Including Nollywood, sure. I know that world much more through Brian Larson's work. He's an anthropologist. Most of you know this book, Signal and Noise, but it's a brilliant book that looks at the infrastructure of Nollywood, and certainly the VCD phenomenon. The video disc is the technology that enables that, the flourishing of that filmmaking. But Frank's work is also really important in charting its evolution. So I'm not wanting this to be a paradigm that we trot around and say, oh, Chinese underground documentary, maybe that's ampersand, right? Like, I don't want to do that. I just was trying to think on the ground about a moment when actually the thing itself, the words of the department title, right, might have the clue, give us a clue as to how to think about, more conceptually, about how to bring these things together, how to think about conjunction, right? So I don't think that Nollywood poses, at least as far as I know, it's sort of an issue of conjunction. Neither do I, well, maybe Chinese underground documentary does. That's a different question. But nonetheless, what I hope to enable is just a sort of conceptual spark that might light up this moment and this problem. in a more meta way. Yeah. Thank you. She's back there.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. Thank you very much, Amy. So I've been struggling with this question recently. When is a web series not a web series?
Yeah.
And another way of asking that might be, why are corporate-sponsored streaming series not web series? And so I wanted to invite you to make a connection between the conjunctions in shows like Couple-ish or K&A and your work on Transparent, and to think about how the queer connection in Transparent is different from the conjunction that you're seeing in the web series.
Awesome, thank you. Very briefly, I think that AJ's work is helpful because I think open TV is kind of a nice way to describe it rather than web series. And what he's emphasizing through that term is this triumvirate of the role of the producer as a kind of central force for development, the role of fans in responding to the work and adjusting the trajectory of the storytellings, the use of crowdfunding, and other ways of funding these that don't therefore answer to corporate parents. It's a wholly different writing process than serial television made on the model of Netflix or Amazon Studios, which in fact have the opposite pressure, right? In Transparent, what's exciting to writers about, to Jill Soloway, but to writers about the working with those platforms is that it's not pilot-based, right? So that they can write 10, 12 episodes, and those are hour-long episodes, and develop character. This was really important for Orange is the New Black. It's, develop character, imagine stories through a very long arc. I mean, imagine like setting out to make a 12-hour film every few months. I mean, it's just an incredible undertaking to write that kind of arc. And these, by contrast, are a few minutes long. They're 3, 4, 5 minutes. Some of them are 2, some of them are 12, but they're short form. The idea of a series is completely open-ended, right? There might be 3 episodes and then someone gets sick or tired or whatever, or gets a new idea. There might be a second series. They might go into a kind of paraprofessional platform. Those are emerging rapidly in this, landscape. And so sort of figuring out what that means in terms of enabling or constraining is interesting, right? So there's this platform called Tello that I'm about to start researching that is a subscription-based lesbian content. I don't even know what that means, but some lesbian thing is on that TV thing. And so you're supposed to go there and pay some fee to subscribe to it, and then you have access to all of their shows, most of which look sort of horrible, but still, that's one model that's arising, and it's expensive. It's like as much as Hulu or something. So I think that in terms of the production and is changing the storytelling in ways that's very, very different from those commercial platforms.
Thank you so much for that. I'm mildly obsessed with one of the Open TV series.
Which one?
Berlioz?
Of course.
Yes.
Yes.
So I'm really interested in terms of what the kind of consequences of how you're posing web seriality.
Yeah.
And so I suppose with that show specifically in mind, because I find that there's something about the form of speculative fiction that is that I find much more satisfying in terms of what you're suggesting with web seriality.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm asking a kind of new restagings of genre kind of
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
And if you could speak to that, I'd
Yeah.
love that. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. What a lovely question. So Brujos is this series that's about a group of gay Latinx graduate students who are also witches. And so you get like a great combo platter of spells and Foucault, right? Like, so that's kind of fun. And it's very engaging. And so I understand why you'd be drawn to it. And, I think actually, Michael, that you answered this question in your piece in Film Quarterly in the dossier in Black Cinema, where you actually talk about TV, except you don't tell us that it's TV, which is the episode called White. That's also speculative fiction, right? I mean, it's so. And the way that you illuminate that for us is, almost as though it's an essay on changing technologies of racialization, and so there's something super interesting about. I went and watched that, thanks to you, about that generically, but it adheres to genre making, as you note, in the tradition of Twilight Zone and other, right? It's a sort of remake of that kind of mode of television. And here I think that I would be willing to say that most of these are, sort of young people comedies. And many of them young people comedies about technology. And so they have a horizon where they're able, as you saw in the Couple-ish episode, they're able to embed some sort of meta-commentary about their relationship or stage a relationship to technological change, but they mostly are also really stoned, or really drunk, or running through some field and falling over, and there's physical comedy, there's the comedy of what we were talking about this morning, the comedy of alcohol and drug use. There's and so that's what they're about, are these young sort of webs of friendship, of love, of whatever, sort of on the genre of physical and other comedy. So I'd be willing to say that that's what a lot of them are, but I don't think it's an argument that I'm making about genre. It's just the ones that I ran through. So something like Dyke Central, that's another one that's gotten a lot of press, is a sort of an apartment comedy, I would say, right? In the Billy Wilder vein or whatever. It's about a cast of characters coming in and out, loves lost and found. But a lot of different, the spectrum of masculinity is astonishing. The spectrum of kind of queer expression is astonishing. It's a lot of people of color. It's set in Oakland. Its horizons are very much about urban life and what it means to live in Oakland. And so, there's a lot of variation, but I would say that that's what I'm drawn to. Yeah.
So thank you for this amazing talk. So I hope to make sense because, anyways, I'm interested, and I know that there's two things that really caught my mind. I like this idea of inhabiting our capacity for aesthetic engagement,
Yeah.
and I was trying to think about that. But, and because of the emphasis of thinking about queerness and people of color, I know that you talk about the displacement of ontology, but I've been thinking, I wonder about agency in terms of thinking about this series, right? And just by chance this morning I was reading about this web series in LA that is to try to help promote Stop HIV from Spread.
Yeah.
It's using a telenovela form. Trying to remember the name, I cannot remember
Yeah, I don't know
it.
that one.
But I'm trying to think about that notion because it also seems that in I don't know, I'm wondering about it. I cannot necessarily say more, but I'm wondering still about this notion of agency, especially if there is this notion of trying to think about, you know, the singularity, try to like allow for a different kind of understanding of embodiment.
Yes.
That is not just, you know, get lost in the information, but that somehow can provide a different sense of being in the world.
Right, that's lovely, thank you, I'm gonna go seek that out. Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense it's also about storytelling and about the power of seriality to engage us over time and to provoke attachments, right, to things that we then incorporate into who we are. And how we understand the world. So that's not new, you know, right? Telenovelas are not new. Neither is even web-based telenovela production, right? Mm-hmm. But the invitation here might be to think about how they're transforming that encounter, the organological encounter, to be Stieglerian, but you know, between the body and the interface, right? What is that? Especially when the body becomes part of what's at stake in the interface, right? So that's super helpful to think about, something that's so explicitly sort of about transforming one's own, so agency, I'm just translating into an orientation of the body to the interface, right? That agency might be in that very naming of the question of HIV, right? Or the prevention of HIV, you know, in that encounter.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm sorry, this is the last question because it's a bit of a depressive comment. So,
oh, it's okay.
It's a concern that I share with Bifo multiple times.
Yeah.
And it's going to come out as a sort of like reiteration of a question, which is what happened when Telestreet becomes YouTube, for example.
Yes, that's precisely what's at stake.
And what happened when the Israeli Defense Forces or the Mossad is reading the laws evilly to create new military strategies? What happened when counterculture becomes mainstream culture? And to paraphrase Fred Turner books from cyberculture to counterculture, or the other way around. And what happened when, again, according to Bifo in a book called On Poetry and Finance, what happened when it's possible to trace financial capitalism back to symbolic poetry and French poetry, and then what happened when it's possible to think about Duchamp, and against this beautiful reading of Lazzarato, which is trying to read Duchamp as in terms of refusal of work. What happened when Duchamp, as much as symbolic poetry, is instead like a symptom and actually a very effective modality and the beginning, if you want, of the precursor of financialization and abstraction and the rupture between semantic and syntax. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. That's maybe the last.
No, I get it.
Because that's something that we're talking through a little bit, and actually quite a lot with Bifo, and I think maybe the issue here is when a minority thoughts or practice become majoritarian. Then it gets things get convoluted, and then this capacity of this horrible monster we are living inside of this capitalism, and it has this capacity of digesting these beautiful disruptive forces, and then incorporating them into the fluxes of connection rather than conjunction, right?
So precisely. So I mean, the answer to that is yes, and. Right? I'll leave it at that.